Okay. Okay, we are live. This is Senate Finance, February 6th. And we are still waiting for a witness. We're being joined by Senate Education Committee. We're going to hear from Rebecca Sebelius, who is the Executive Director of Ed Fund, and I will let her tell you what they do. The House had 3 national experts on the foundation formula in. They did it in the morning, so we couldn't join them. And we haven't been able to get all 3 together in any reasonable time frame. So we're hearing from Rebecca today, and we're hearing somebody from the education, next week.
Education Commission of the state.
Education Commission of the States next week. And they're going to help us think through what are the elements, if we are going to do a foundation formula, what elements should that have to be the strongest that it can be. So we are waiting for Rebecca. We probably need to stand.
Is Senate Ed hear us right now?
It is. I think so, but I don't know. We can
They're not
see that.
indicating it. They're not acting like they can.
Daughter, can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear
Oh,
you.
yes.
Okay.
They can hear. So you should be here. Can somebody hit the blue button over there that says okay? If I know.
Try the chairs around.
When I walked in, yeah, I like that.
I mean, for you to have the camera back here,
Oh, shoot.
that's probably where, then you could get the whole table.
Oh, rude.
Are you looking at your
I
stuff?
better be in.
No, I'm looking
Yeah.
to see how much snow we're gonna get.
Oh, there she is.
There she is, okay.
I apparently went back in time. I was on a link for yesterday.
Oh.
Okay, well, we just signed in. I'm Ann Cummings, I chair finance. And I think, why don't we go around and just have the senators introduce themselves? And then I don't know if Senate Education, who is joining us, would like to do that. And then we'll have you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then the floor is yours. So Chris, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Chris Maddox, represent Chittenden County, Northwest Vermont.
Hello, Rebecca, Senator Martine LaRock Ulick. I represent Chittenden Central, the Burlington area.
Just in time, hi, I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District.
I'm Ann Cummings, right here, Washington.
I'm Tom Chittenden. I represent part of Chittenden County.
Hey, Rebecca, I'm Scott Beck at Caledonia, northeast corner of the state on the river.
I'm Randy Brock. I represent Franklin County and part of Grand Isle County, the northwestern quarter of the state.
So Senator Bongartz, do you want to have your people introduce themselves? Are you there? We are not hearing you. So maybe we will just continue. You can hear us? Okay. So Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I unfortunately have not spent a lot of time in Vermont, but during the COVID summer, I rented a place in Manchester Village for a little while and just thought it was quite beautiful. And so I'm very excited to be here. I will tell you a little bit about myself. I feel like I've been in school finance since the dinosaurs were walking the earth. I started as a CFO for what was essentially the State Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and didn't really have a finance background. And so in that role, I was able to kind of take this outsider's view of the way that we fund schools. And I thought, man, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I went into advocacy for a little while. And what I realized in that part of my career is that it isn't that legislators don't necessarily want to improve and have continual improvement on the way that they fund schools, but rather they had few tools at their disposal in order to really do that well. And so I created an organization that was called EdBuild. For about 5 years, we tried to raise national awareness around how schools are funded and how states could do that better. Went to the Gates Foundation for a few years and had the privilege of helping them to shape an investment strategy for state school finance reform, and have now started another new nonprofit because I'm apparently a glutton for punishment. This one is EdFund, and we're focused on funding more actionable research to answer real questions that lawmakers have about how to do things better. Because I think for a long time, we've been stuck in this question of like, does money matter? And all of these costing out studies. And at the end of the day, when we're living in a constricted resource environment, we need to have research that kind of helps us to understand a little bit more about like for whom, under what circumstances, and from where school money should come. And so our focus is to move the research field in that direction. In the meantime, we are also focused on bringing what we know so far about research to folks like you who are considering changes to the way that you're funding schools, so that hopefully what we know so far can inform your decisions. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that century's worth of long experience. But if that was boring, I'm happy to jump into just a few slides that I'd like to talk you through.
I think we'll just get on to the,
Fantastic.
we'll see that you have a lot more experience than most of us, so.
Well, not in what matters, I think, but we'll see. All right, so let me figure out if I can share my screen. After 6 years of doing this, you'd think that I'd have this under control.
Yep, you are up.
Woohoo! All right.
There we go. That's perfect.
So thank you again for allowing me to be here. This should only take about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm happy to answer whatever questions I may be able to. So I just want to take a step back and talk about kind of how we've gotten here, and a little bit about the history of school finance so that we can talk about how policy and research have followed the theory of school finance. And so in the 1970s, there were 2 really important court cases that went before the Supreme Court. San Antonio v. Rodriguez is the one that most folks are a little bit more familiar with. The Supreme Court basically said there is no federal right to an education. And so that sent all of the responsibility basically down to the states, as you know. I think more important case that tends to be overlooked was a case called Milliken v. Bradley. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that if the state draws a line anywhere for any reason, that the federal government can't mandate desegregation across that line. And while it was a desegregation case, it also served to really kind of codify and give a lot of power to the school district border as it exists, and started to create some major inequities in terms of what school districts were able to raise out of the property wealth that was within their borders. So because of that, a bunch of the litigants that basically tried to take this work to the Supreme Court then took this argument on a state-by-state basis. And one of the first and most influential cases at the state level was Serrano v. Priest. In that case, we saw the California Supreme Court rule that funding from property taxes was an inequitable way to approach education for all students. And so they mandated as part of the resolution of that case that property taxes be pooled in at least the county level in California. And there was a big backlash to that. And it led to Proposition 13, which is pretty notably known even today as a pretty regressive scheme to that has ended up falsely deflating the amount of money that's in the education system. So this was the first time where we really saw a pursuit of equity in terms of low versus high wealth school districts really start to butt up against the question of adequacy, which is if we start to cap how much money is in the system, will we start to starve our schools of those resources? That continued into what I considered to be the adequacy phase. So once we had a whole bunch of states that capped how much their local school districts could raise, started to deflate the amount of money that was in the system. And then we started once again going to the state courts and arguing that there wasn't enough money in the system now to deliver a high quality education. The first of those rulings was Rose v. Council for a Better Education. That was in Kentucky. And that was kind of a bellwether that then moved forward where the Kentucky courts said, in fact, the school districts throughout the state were significantly underfunded. They actually mandated a funding level from the legislature. And that was really a substantial reach for the courts, considering kind of where they had been over time. The reason I go through this is because we've now entered this phase that I feel is kind of trying to balance or counterbalance the unintended consequences of those two phases, which is that we're trying on one hand to make sure that low wealth school districts have enough money in order to keep up with their higher wealth peers, but at the same time, not putting such restrictions in place that we start to skew equity toward the highest wealth school districts. I know that that's a big part of the conversation that you're having right now. And I'll talk through a little bit about how states have tried to grapple with that. Just to quickly recap, the equity theory is to equalize resources across school districts. There's both vertical equity, which is every school district gets the same amount of money in order to serve their students on a per student basis. There's what we call horizontal equity, which is what you're looking at in terms of foundation, which is building on top of vertical equity to recognize that some students have additional learning needs. But the biggest part of that equity constraint was, what do you do about property taxes? Do you just leave them unfettered? And if so, what does that do to skew the equity? In terms of adequacy, we're obviously focused on increasing resources across all school districts. But oftentimes, if that's just the focus and you're ignoring potential inequities that may be built into your formula, then all you're doing is perpetuating the inequities, which is something that we're trying to balance for, as I mentioned, still to this day. So these are just two theories that consistently kind of butt heads against each other and need to be constantly considered as states are thinking about moving to new structures. The proposal that I know is on the table right now, you're calling a foundation formula. In a lot of other states, they're called weighted student formulas. And there is really positive emerging research on the effects of weighted student formulas. In California, about 10, 12 years ago, California moved from one of the most kind of resource-based funding formulas where they funded a certain number of teachers per a certain count of students, et cetera. They were really funding like the inputs of education. And they moved to a weighted student formula, which is what you're considering, a base amount per student and then weights for student need. What recent research, now that we have about 10 years of that, has found is that particularly for low-income students and for English language learners, there was much more rapid academic growth. So both in terms of achievement on math and English language arts test scores, we saw those significantly increase for the students who were receiving those weights. And the school districts that were getting the highest weights, the most concentrated funding out of that weighted student formula, saw many more students who were completing college prep coursework, and that gap significantly shrunk. Another most recent study coming out of Tennessee looked at a large school district that went from a resource-based formula, handing out teachers, handing out principals, et cetera, to a student-based formula, which was, here's your money based on the students and your needs. Go staff and implement programs as you think are fit. And they saw gains, I know this starts to get inane, but of 0.1 standard deviation increases in both math and reading. And to put that into perspective, all of this like money matters research that we've heard about in recent times, we've found that to have a moderate increase. That was 0.05 of a standard deviation. So just the implementation of this new weighted student formula in Tennessee saw about twice the effects of just putting more money into the system. So what it's telling us is it's not just about the amount of money that's going in, but also how that's being distributed. So a look at formula types across the country. There are about 17 states now that are using a resource-based approach. Again, where they're putting, funding inputs into the system. Vermont, as many others, are considered to be a weighted student formula. We could talk about where your consideration is differing on the next slide, but important to note here that one, you're in line with what most states are doing. Two, the states that are still funding based on inputs, so all of the states that have red of some sort are actively considering school funding reforms this year. So there is an increasing trajectory against these resource-based funding formulas. Local taxes. So you guys are gray here. So you're one of the, I'm sorry. You're one of the states that is recognized as having obviously your statewide property tax that gets collected at the state level and then distributed through the funding formula. When we took a look at how other states are doing this, they largely allow their local school districts to raise their own resources. In most cases, largely outside of the funding formula. And you can see that it's everything from property taxes to income taxes to excise taxes, motor vehicle licenses. There's a lot of stuff in many states that are able to be contributed to schools and have differing impacts in terms of equity and equity considerations. Did you have a question?
I'm not seeing any. Do we
Okay.
have?
That must have been a cough. It's tough to present virtually.
I'll ask the other room. Are there any questions in Senate Ed? We can't see you, so you're gonna have to holler.
I don't see any hands up.
All right.
I think we're still good to go.
Great.
Gonna take us a time to digest all of this.
I believe it.
Can I assume that the multicolored stripes are a variety?
Yes.
Okay.
So where you see, for instance, I'll just go back. Let's see if I could go back one slide. I often call this like the 70s dad striped tie. And so in many cases, in several states, states are able to raise a number of different revenues. You'll see most often the combination is property valuation and income/wealth goes into a calculation of how much the state is expecting locals to raise. But then when you see other local receipts and a share of other costs, that's where states are able to raise money that's outside of the funding formula.
Okay.
I actually ask, after all, what does no specific expectation mean?
Oh, you got a great question there. What that assumes is that the state has taken on all responsibility of funding
Okay.
education. And so anything that may be able to be raised outside of that funding formula is happening outside of what the state is saying is needed in order to adequately fund schools.
Okay, thank you.
I think at some point it might, if you could email us some information on how the state deal with it. Income base. It sounds like it goes in along with property wealth, but any information you have on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy even to talk through that in a minute. But we have a website where you can run lots of different reports, and I'll make sure that you have that. And I'll follow up with the details on states that consider income and property wealth. In terms of kind of how you create a foundation formula, the way that it happens in almost all states is that there's a calculation at the state level of how much every school district needs. They subtract out what they expect the locals should contribute based on that combination of all of the other taxes that I had up on the last screen. And then they give out the difference. So that's the way that, you know, a state mechanism works. So the question then is, what can happen outside of that state mechanism? Are local communities able to raise additional resources? And if so, how does that happen? So as you can see, there are many states who have actually put a ceiling on how much school districts can raise that's outside of the formula. And there are states that are kind of a combination of like liberal and like conservative. And so there's tends to be really no political theory behind this, which is just an interesting observation. There are also some states like yours that require a floor contribution. So you have to at least contribute X amount of money. In other states, it's just expected. But local taxpayers can decide whether or not they're going to raise what the state is expecting, more or less. Special education, I know, has been a topic of conversation, and wanted to talk a little bit about this. So the majority of states fund special education using multiple student weights. So you can see that that's in place in 18 states across the country. And this ranges from, I think, Tennessee just passed 8 different weights, depending on the specific student characteristics. Florida has 5. Some states only have 3. But what they basically do is they say that certain students, based on their special diagnosis, have a general basket, you know, cost basket of costs. And so they'll assign a different weight for each of those tiers or each of those classifications. One of the reasons why states have been moving toward a weighted student formula, even for special education students, is because we are seeing some research that's coming out that the way that you're funding special education could contribute to incentives in the actual practice of providing special education that could be positive or negative. There's been a long-standing kind of debate over whether or not funding using student weights will encourage school districts to over-identify students into special education. What we actually find in the research is that it's the opposite. When you only provide one weight, it tends to under-identify the students that are in special education, and I'm happy to come back to talk about that as well. Just talk a little bit about recent reforms, who's come before you. Tennessee moved from a resource-based funding formula to a completely weighted student formula, I guess going on 3 years ago now. That was really a bellwether for the southern states who were kind of continuing to fund using this resource-based formula, which is really almost all states are moving away from. Michigan overhauled the way that it was considering poverty. So they used to consider low-income students as just a single weight. If you're low income, you get a weight in your formula. What they've moved to is actually a tiered weight depending on the concentration of low-income students in the school district, which is just an interesting approach that follows how California restructured their funding formula several years ago. Tends to be kind of what many of the states that are moving to new systems have been grappling with. What is the how do we deal with the tension between what communities look like and what students look like, and are there different needs that schools have to address within those tensions? Last year, Mississippi and Colorado also moved to weighted student formulas, foundation formulas, mirroring largely what Tennessee had done. And this year, we know for sure that Alabama will be doing something in terms of moving toward weighted student formula. They may stay with a hybrid, but as you can get a general sense, there has been significant movement over the past several years of states that are overhauling the way that they fund schools. You're not alone. And this was after what I would consider to be a significant lull in how states were thinking about how they were funding schools. And I believe that is it for me. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'm happy to answer questions or put any of the maps back up to talk through any of your thoughts.
Committee questions. Senator Chittenden.
I'll ask a clarifying question. I recall you characterizing formula with one term and then another term to what we are contemplating. Could you just crystallize how you would characterize and describe the current system in Vermont, and then what I assume you're familiar with what our administration, our governor's office has put forward. What are the two terms?
Yeah, so weighted student formula is generally how we're trying to standardize the practice of having a base amount per student and then additional multipliers for student need. That's in the allocation model. So you're already kind of doing that in your allocation model. What's different about what you're considering right now is moving from, as I understand it, the budget-based approach in terms of local taxpayer approval to more of a expected local contribution. That is more of the practice that goes along with what I would consider to be a traditional weighted student formula. So when I was saying a foundation formula, the foundation element of the way that old school finance folks have defined foundation formulas is the idea that there's an expected local contribution that's coming in, and it's coming in off of revenue rather than coming in off of a budget that's being approved.
Clarify, what I understood that you just say is we currently have a weighted student formula. It's just not traditional. And what you recognize and what the administration is putting forward is a more traditional weighted student formula that I believe I also heard you say many other states have migrated to over the past 5 to 10 years.
Correct.
Thank
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation, Rebecca, and for the slides. I have a quick question for you. We're obviously about to, not obviously, but we apparently are about to embark on some pretty major changes here in Vermont. And I would say there are many folks who are worried, concerned that what we might be heading toward is something that might look like a universal quote unquote choice system or voucher system. And I'm wondering, are any of these funding models more conducive to allowing that to happen at all? Could you speak to that?
I can. So let me see if I can project a map that I just put together yesterday, because we get this question a lot. I will say that, you know, the research says for public schools that a weighted student formula really makes a difference in inspiring equity. But there have been these significant concerns to mirror what you were just saying, that once you put a quote unquote price tag on a student, rather than having a community-based approach to funding schools, that all of a sudden then that money becomes very portable. And so a lot of folks who have thought about moving to a weighted student formula have basically said, well, that's just going to open us up to vouchers because there's a number on every student and all of a sudden this money is going to go everywhere. And what we actually find is that there is really no correlation between the way that states fund schools and how widespread their choice is. So just to share this really quickly with you, this is a map of the states that have what we consider to be a generally student-based funding formula, a weighted student formula. And every state that has a star is a state that has introduced ESAs that I would consider to be pretty significant ESAs, right? There are lots of states who have an ESA for special education students and that sort of thing, but these are some of the more universal programs. What you'll see is that there are 6 states, that's actually should be updated to 7 because Tennessee just passed ESAs this year, that have weighted student formulas and ESAs. There are 9 states that have ESAs without a weighted student formula. And then there are 20 states that have a weighted student formula that have no ESAs. And so when you kind of look across the country on school funding and the implementation of
Can you stop and explain what you mean by an ESA?
yes.
So what is it? What it says, but what is it actually?
Yeah. Yep. So an education savings account, in the way that I'm describing it, is an amount of money that's set aside by the legislature that follows a student to any sort of mostly private or a combination of private education services. Usually that money goes to a private school that the student may enroll in. In some cases, that could be a family that's homeschooling their students. That's additional resources for them to do so. In a few cases, that has been a family that has created some sort of blended environment where they're doing some at-home tutoring, some private school tuition. But the ESA is generally a program that is moving students out of the public school and into private options that their family may vary depending on how flexible that system is.
Okay, thank you.
Fear of getting in front of my colleagues over at Senate Education, I was hoping to ask one more question. Can you reflect on any other states that might have done school construction and capital funding in a unique or creative way worth overlaying in these conversations here in Vermont?
Yeah. And so first of all, let me start with the research. 3 studies over the past 2 years have shown significant improvements in student achievement with what they were considering to be less recognizable capital improvements. And so what they found, there was a study that was done of, I think, 32 states. It comprised basically 80% of the school districts in the country. What they found is that for bonds that were issued to build theaters or new stadiums, that those tended to increase property values around the school district. But when bonds were raised for internal improvements like HVAC or new water filtration systems, that tended to improve achievement. So I'm happy to send you that new study. It's really wide-reaching and very compelling. So the research is there.
Roofs leaking.
Yeah, right.
I'm sorry?
We're talking about leaking roofs
Yeah.
and bathroom doors with latches that don't work. So,
Yes.
um,
And so what you would see are the academic achievement side of the findings in this study. So I'll make sure that I send that along following this conversation. What a few states have done. So there's kind of three things that states can do. And I need to be honest, I don't know how Vermont is doing this right now, so I can't compare. But three things that states can do. They can bond for them, issue their own state bonds and distribute those resources to school districts. So that's number one, the state just bonds, receives capital funds and sends that to districts. The second is a credit enhancement program, whereby states just set aside money into a savings account and they back loans that school districts will take out. It allows school districts to borrow at a significantly lower interest rate. And that allows them then to actually leverage what they can borrow from tax proceeds into, a higher bond and much more available revenue for capital constructions. And then the third is just direct loans straight out of the operating budget. Ohio does direct loans straight out of their operating budget every year. They actually do a facilities assessment of every school in the state, and they rank both the facilities need of the schools and also the wealth of the district, and will go in opposite rank order. So the lowest wealth districts with the highest needs get just appropriations straight out of the general fund. I think there are at least 18 states that are doing credit enhancements to support their school districts. Costs the state nothing, and really does make a difference for school districts in terms of what they can borrow. And I don't have a count of direct loans, but that's just basically a revolving fund. You can give resources to school districts at a lower interest rate than what they would get privately.
okay. Senate Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you. Question.
We had one question. Do we send her after that? We want to start a question?
I believe she answered it.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody? Okay, no.
Ruth.
Okay, nothing from there.
Rebecca, thank you. I'm looking at your website and I'm having a hard time finding some of the things you're referencing on your website. Will you be able to send us relevant links?
Yes, and I can also just give it to you right now. It's the website is FundEd, so FUNDED .edbuild EDBUILD.org. And when you pull that up, you should see all of the national maps that I've just projected, but then there's also summaries of how states do their stuff. In some cases, you're going to see that we've had to simplify it in order to make it standardized across all 50 states. But you can also run a report that compares Vermont to New Hampshire for each of the elements of school funding that we thought were important enough to call out and try to standardize. Did you get the website now?
Yes, okay, I was looking at your organization.
Yeah, we have to pull that over. This is the problem of like the one startup and then the other startup. So
Okay. Well, another question I have is, it's great to see these interstate comparisons across the country. But often when we're comparing policy, we compare to other states. I've done a lot of work in health policy. So we compare Vermont to other states in health policy, and our health indicators in Vermont are actually quite good. So, comparing us to the South is in some ways not that helpful because thankfully we've done a better job.
Yeah.
So often it's helpful to compare us to other countries. So I'm wondering if I know that other countries' taxation systems and governance systems are so radically different, but are there other countries that we could look at that have something we could learn from to import to Vermont?
I would actually say that some of the countries that you may be looking at, not just in terms of education, but also life expectancy and that sort of thing, would be Canadian provinces. And we've actually seen Canada move in the direction of where you are and not the direction of where you're headed. There were 3 or 4 provinces, I think, in Canada that recently went to a completely state-funded system for their schools. And so just like you do right now, collecting property taxes, distributing them through some sort of formula. In some cases, it's not a weighted student formula. The majority of European countries are funding as a state-funded system. So they don't have this element of local taxes that are contributing to school districts, largely because their public school systems weren't built the way that ours were as we colonized over time. I would recommend, though, thinking about Connecticut and taking a look at what Connecticut recently did. They went through a massive overhaul of how they were funding schools, and they continue to incrementally change what they're doing. I would say over the past 5 or 6 years, they've been adding one more element to their new funding formula. But there was a good deal of work that went into looking at what the research says about improving schools through the way that they're funded. Connecticut landed on a combination of property valuation and income, average household income, whereby they deduct what's expected from high property value areas where there's a lower than state median household income, and they increase it for the reverse. It's an interesting model. They're right now looking at moving to a special education system that's almost a kind of more of a insurance-based special education system, which is really interesting and unique. And so you do have a neighbor that's considering innovations that has been really looking at this stuff in depth for quite some time. And there's lots of research and reports on what they've been doing. And so may not be a bad idea to just take a look at what the Connecticut School and State Finance Project has been putting out.
Okay, thank you.
We do now have a question here in this room. Senator Heffernan.
So out of all these systems, which do you believe would be the best for Vermont?
So I have to tell you that we had asked that of ourselves over the course of the 5 years that we were studying how every state does things. And I would say it's a Frankenstein. There's no one state that's doing things really well on every measure. But I will send as a follow-up another tool that you may be interested in. It's called the Ed Builder. And it takes you through every element of what you need to consider for school funding. So how to best fund for special education, how to best calculate a local contribution. And it will give you a silver, gold, and moonshot option. And in each of those, it actually links to the code for the states that we identify as being models in that one area. And so, for instance, you'll find a link in our gold standard for special education funding to Florida. And so each one of those will have a link. There's a link to how Ohio has codified their funding for English language learners because they're one of the gold standards for that. And so, I would tell you that there's no state in the country where you can just pick up what they're doing and say, we've done it all. This is the best that we could possibly do for every student and every consideration. But there are states out there that are leading on the multiple considerations that you're thinking through right now.
Okay, and you're gonna send us that link?
We'll do that. I'm guessing I send it through Charlotte.
That, yes, and we can print that out and put it on our website, and that will give us a good base to start building on. Okay, Sandra.
One other question for me. The last question got me thinking about this, and so I'll ask you. I've read a few articles about the really great outcomes that we have in the DoD schools, Department of Defense schools. I was wondering, have you studied their model at all? And is there anything we can take away from their model or learn from their model or try to adopt?
I mean, I'm not a pedagogy expert. I'm not an academic. And so I don't know what they're doing in their classrooms. I can say that they don't have the complicating factor of local funds. The state that I was the CFO for, DC as the state, also didn't have that complicating factor of local funds. And so when you have a program or a system that you want to put in place that you think is going to accelerate student achievement, you can do so a lot easier because you don't have that complicating factor of we've got to get the taxpayers to buy in and how do we explain this to them and that sort of thing. And so, state funded systems tend to have at least that advantage, which is you can move quickly to implement new programs. And so from a funding perspective, that's what I would say is unique about DoD.
Thank you.
I have another question, and before that, just a quick comment. I'd be really curious if, like Florida got the gold star for special education funding. I'm wondering if Vermont has any gold stars, but that's not my question. My question really has to do with another topic that's come before us, and I'm curious if you would reflect on it because it does seem like you know these systems really, really well. Do you know of any state out there that has entirely switched away from property taxes as a revenue to fund education? And I'm assuming the answer is no. And then my next follow-up question would be why? I think I have an idea of the answer, but I'd love to hear it come from you.
No is the answer. I mean, there's Hawaii and DC who fund out of their general fund, so it's a mix of property taxes and everything else. The root of school funding, and this is the thing that has always driven me crazy, is that we started funding schools using property taxes. And so the lawsuits that we had where we said that's inequitable, no one actually ended up saying, well, why don't we stop doing things that way? What they said was, well, the legislature should make up for the difference, right? We're not going to stop how we've always done things, but the legislature is going to use their general funds to make up for the difference. Now, what researchers will tell you is that there's a circular relationship between school quality and property value. And so funding using property taxes kind of cements that relationship, that circular relationship. I don't like to think about things that way because then I think, well, some communities are just going to forever be left behind. Other people, economists will say we should continue to fund using property taxes because they're the most stable. And when we go through recessions, we want to make sure that we're shoring up our most important service, which is education of our students. So there's lots of ways that people will answer that. I'm not sure that I can tell you what's in the mind of anyone else who has thought about changing the way that they're funding schools away from property taxes. But I will say it's probably one of those things: inertia, the circular relationship, or the stability of the tax base. there are states that have started collecting property taxes, putting it into their general fund, and then redistributing. So Nevada just started doing that a few years ago. I think there's another state, Nebraska, or one of those states out there that's doing that. But they largely anchor how much they're putting into education to what they're raising from their property tax receipts. So they haven't broken the link.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Thank you. This has given us a lot to think about, and any information you can give us will be helpful.
Thank you for having me. And I will tell you that you do have a gold star. And so I'm going to leave you hanging on that so that everyone goes to the tool to figure out where exactly your gold star is.
Our gold star.
On the side.
Thank you again for having me. And I'm available for any follow-up questions that you may have. I'll follow up with Charlotte with some of these materials.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Very helpful. Committee. Give you a few minutes to let it all sink in, but I think we're gonna have to do like session as to what we know or don't know. And
Big part for me is I really want to understand school construction that we didn't get to last Friday, and what she just said, if that has been part of what you're going to be presenting, it's a big open question for me.
No, won't necessarily be me presenting that, but Chris Roop and John Gray certainly answering that.
they're
Yeah,
coming in next week.
and maybe Michael Gahn from the bond bank.
We will, as we go through school construction, we're gonna talk about the bond bank.
Thank you for letting us into the room. We're gonna go off. That's over and have a discussion. But thank you for inviting us.
Okay, thank you for joining us. All right, we have a break scheduled. I don't know if you want to take it or I think everybody's kind of watching out the window. We could move forward. We have the Act 30, the insurance statutes, and we have a gubernatorial appointment on today. And are we supposed to be doing S35?
H35.
H35.
Yeah.
Unmurdered.
Maybe I didn't give you an updated, we have an updated one. Okay, yeah, I think this is the original. We have H35 on too.
Yep.
We can just vote those at this point if people are ready.
No. I will.
Change three sheets for Carrie Johnson. And I was changed. The clerk
Thank
is
you.
going to have to call the roll.
What do you want to start with, Madam Chair?
My thing, which doesn't have H35 on it, says that the first bill is S30, which is the act relating to updating and reorganizing the health insurance statutes. Are we ready to vote on that, or do we want to? Okay, it sounds like Jen has run it by everybody, DFR, the Medical Society. They didn't want to testify. They were all here. So if we're ready to vote, I would love a motion to approve.
I move that we vote to approve or concur, I think, because it's
No,
as introduced, approve S30 as introduced.
Okay. Senator Hardy has moved that we approve S30, an act relating to updating and reorganizing the health insurance statutes in 8 BSA Chapter 107.
One second.
Yes, I don't think we need
I
a
don't either, but
second,
I can do
but
it
we
anyway.
have one. Any further discussion? If not, clerk, call the roll.
All right. Senator Chittenden.
Yes.
Senator Hardy.
Yes.
Senator Gulick.
Yes.
Senator Brock.
Yes.
Senator Beck.
Yes.
Senator Matos, yes. Senator Cummings.
Yes. 7-0. And Senator Hardy has kind of sort of volunteered to report that one.
We'll do that. Sure.
Can I ask a question? Should I don't even really care? How did that order of people come about?
It's on the piece of paper.
I know, but
Oh, the
where does that order come from?
I made.
It's not alphabetical.
Majority party.
I think it's the pecking order of the committee and committees.
Yeah.
And I-
Yeah.
That's,
All right.
that's true. I'm
Just
way at the bottom.
Like me, no.
And I,
Oh, you're three.
I,
You want to stay where you are.
Senator Cummings, that she's chair, and we'll go there last.
Yeah, I think that we did.
We did that in the house.
Anyway, that's 7-0 and that sheet stays here.
Yeah.
And we will get the original bill and they should be sticking their heads in this door momentarily. And if not, Senator Hardy can take that up. Okay, the next one I have is the gubernatorial appointment. I'm gonna find all Karen Johnson's information.
On our website, it's H35.
It's H35.
I don't know if that makes. it.
No, it's the next one. This is the appointment, Karen Johnson for,
Oh, I'm just looking at our online
On the agenda.
oh, it's
agenda.
on the agenda. Okay, we'll go to H35. And that is the merging of the individual and the small group health insurance market. It seems like the way to get the most advantageous rates for the most people. Given what we know today about the state of federal subsidies and the health insurance market, understanding that could change momentarily and we might have to come back and do something else. But under the present conditions, this is the way that the advocates, the department all feel we should go. So I could use a motion to approve.
I will move that the Senate Finance Committee approve H35 and act relating to merging the individual and small group health insurance markets.
Okay. Senator Laura Gulick has moved that we approve H35. Is there further discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Senator Chittenden.
Yes.
Senator Hardy.
Yes.
Senator Gulick.
Yes.
Senator Brock.
Yes.
Senator Beck.
Yes.
Senator Matos, yes. Senator Cummings.
Yes. That is a strange. Would you like a different sequence?
No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which one.
I mean, just pick different names as I go down on the.
Senator Smith. Senator Jones.
Yeah, I think you just used to kind of dozing off to the person before you all. It gets called.
On your toes.
Do it randomly every time.
I'm gonna do it randomly in the next one.
It's very, yeah.
And then
I'm
it's
calling that 7-0.
700, yes.
Who would like to report that one? I can do it if no one
Someone's gonna help.
wants to.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'll do it if you want me.
Well, you've already got one.
Yeah.
I'm going
They're
to,
both really easy to do, so it's up to you, Madam Chair. I assume you'll do Mr. Johnson.
I think as chair, I will do Eric.
Not one to shirk work, but healthcare, I just still barely understand and try. So that's why I try.
I can do both of them. This one is easy.
You want this one?
I'll do this.
You guys are gonna eat those words.
Okay. No, I'm not on that one.
No, okay.
No, there are some others.
Alright.
All right. And then we have next the appointment of Karen Johnson to be the Commissioner of the Department of Public Service, right? That is still the name of that department. We have talked to him. I think we have satisfied that he's a viable candidate?
Now, I subsequently did have a discussion with representatives of the administration yesterday regarding their due diligence, and they went through with to the extent of due diligence that they did, including criminal record check, and also the same kind of discussion that we had with them regarding the potential of any conflict of interest based on prior employment, and they were satisfied that there was no such conflict.
I feel better knowing that that had been done. I would be a little concerned if it hadn't. And that probably explains why he was so well prepared for our questions yesterday. Okay. So do I have a motion?
I'll move to approve Derek Johnson as Commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission.
Public Service Department.
Public Service Department, Public Service.
That is the correct title. Okay. Further discussion. Not clerk will call the roll.
I'm going completely random here, by the way. Senator Gulick,
Ooh, yes.
Senator Beck,
Yes.
Senator Chittenden,
Yes.
Senator Brock,
Yes.
Senator Hardy,
Yes.
Senator Mattos, yes. Senator Cummings.
Yes, and I will report that one. Okay. Thank you, committee. I'm gonna get you out, looking out the window. And I have to walk down and get my car and hope they finish.
Be careful.
Yeah, I think the roads, the sidewalks may be more dangerous than the roads, but we are